recording from my previous session?
I didn't see it come through, so if you
Okay,
wouldn't mind just sending me the link to it, I'll trim the beginning and end off this one before we post it, but
sounds good.
appreciate it. Yeah, we've got a few students who are just super busy right around the sort of time that we have most of these scheduled, so we've agreed that they can watch the videos and then do a little post on our online forum about it and just sort of some key thing takeaways for them as so that they can get credit for them towards their sure certificate at the end of the summer. So
So it looks about like half of registrants are here, which is usually an indication that we might be able to get started. So I'm ready to go if we're ready to start. All right. So Jordan, I don't know if you wanted to say anything. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this session on writing a narrative literature review. The approach that I take is first we sort of consider why we write these types of documents in the first place before getting into some of the pragmatics of things that you'll need to consider if this is something that you are writing either this summer or in the future. So my name is Jill McMillan. If you want to get in touch with me because you have questions about this session or about just writing in general, you're more than welcome to get in touch. We do have a range of writing and communication support that is available at the library. So we have different workshops throughout the year. We have some older workshop recordings on the website, and those are sort of being updated on an intermittent basis. We have, of course, the amazing Writing Help Center, and that is still open in the spring and summer. So if you are looking to get feedback on your writing, regardless of what stage you are in the writing process, you're more than welcome to take advantage of that service. We get better as writers as we get feedback, because that helps us to understand how readers are actually perceiving our work. So I encourage everyone to seek out feedback, and the Writing Help Center is one way that you can get that insight into how others are engaging with your work. We also have English as an additional language support programming, so that might be of interest to you or people that you know. And we also have different activities, events throughout the year. So this June, for instance, I'm running productivity sessions 3 times a week. So in person on Monday mornings and then online Wednesday evenings and Friday mornings. So if you're working on a project and you're just having a little bit of difficulty finding the time or focus to get some work done, sometimes you can benefit from being in a sort of a social context where you know that other people are focused and working as well. All right, so this is our agenda for our session today. It is a longer session, about an hour and a half, though we will try and finish a little bit earlier in case there are questions. But our agenda is as follows. So we're going to begin by conceptualizing the literature review, thinking about how we prepare to write the literature review, focusing on synthesizing sources to enhance readability, and lastly, exploring strategies for organizing literature reviews. So let's begin by conceptualizing the literature review, really interrogating why this is something that we have to worry about at all. And the way in which I begin conversations around literature reviews is through the lens of the academic conversation. Because, in essence, what we're trying to do with a literature review is really get a grasp on what it is that other scholars, thinkers, have been writing about, thinking about, talking about in relation to a given topic or related topics. And so when we're thinking about the academic conversation, how ideas are shared and expanded on, interrogated, dismissed, it really is within this context of listening and responding. There's a social interaction here, even if it might seem that we're doing work in isolation. So, similar to a conversation, this is how we are participating as scholars in this larger academic conversation. So, we are first locating literature, and this is something that librarians can provide a lot of support with. And then we are engaging with that literature by reading it, interrogating, analyzing it. And that is helping feed into the actual writing of the literature review. So, if we were to extend this analogy of a conversation, it really is about trying to pull together a sense of what others have been saying and writing, thinking about how we are responding to that information. Are we accepting it? Are we critiquing it? Are we seeing patterns emerge among different writers, for instance? And then how we are taking that information and communicating it out to other people. Um, and that really is the focus of the literature review. So how we're taking all that information, sort of repackaging it and sharing it back out. So, literature reviews really can be understood as a means for consolidating this broad academic conversation. And in other words, what is known or not known about a given topic? What have scholars and thinkers sort of come to consensus around? Where are there still questions remaining? And the literature review can exist as an independent document. So you will see published literature reviews. But generally speaking, one of the key values of a literature review is that it provides justification for more research. And so it's contextualizing, providing an argument for why we are undertaking a particular research topic. And so that literature review, it really is a product of this interdependent process of, locating literature, thinking about that literature, comparing literature, and writing about that literature. And in terms of the actual text that we produce, one of the chief characteristics is that of a synthesis of sources. So I'm going to pose a question to you, and you can make use of the chat box to respond. So my first question to you today is, what kind of variables will affect how complicated or not the process of putting together a literature review will be? What do you think? What might make things more complicated or less complicated? What are your thoughts? What might we have to take into consideration when we are approaching this type of task? So let's take about 2 minutes and contribute in the chat. Or if you're feeling very bold, you can unmute and contribute that way. So I've just started putting thumbs up to basically everything that's coming up in the chat because you're identifying some really, really key considerations. So everything from, how much literature is actually available to you, because this is one of the tricky thing sometimes about a literature review is that depending on how you are scoping your search, you might find nothing or next to nothing because perhaps you've been far too narrow in terms of what you're looking for. And so there is this need to sort of step back and think maybe a little bit more broadly, or a little bit more conceptually in order to see how you can make connections to other types of information. Conversely, if your scope is too large, you might find tens of thousands of potentially relevant documents. And realistically, you're probably not going to be able to look at that amount of literature. So that is a really key consideration, how much literature is actually available to you, because that will make things more straightforward or less straightforward. Um, so there's reference to ethics. I did have a question about that because I'm like, what is this speaking to, like getting ethical approval in the first place for the research study? Because yes, ethics will be a consideration, because um, it if you don't receive your ethics approval, actually undertaking a literature review might be end up being a little bit of a non-starter if you can't actually take on that project. But for actually carrying out a literature review on a given topic, if the end result is just a literature review as opposed to context for new research, ethics might not be much of a barrier. That being said, it might be that there's information that you want to get access to, but maybe you don't have clearance to gain access to it. So there are some potential barriers just in terms of getting access to different types of information. Overlapping areas of inquiry. So if you have like an interdisciplinary topic, knowing how to search for information across different disciplines is going to be a potential complication. Knowing how or where to find literature in the first place, so navigating different databases, your general area of knowledge, your grounding. Because if you are researching, if you're searching for information, but in parallel you're also still learning about that topic, in parallel to that, that's going to be a complication because without having a sufficient grounding, it might be a little bit harder to discern what is or isn't relevant um, to to your literature review because the more grounding you have, it's going to be easier to determine whether or not you're going to include certain sources. General relevance of the data of the information. So all of those contributions, super, super valuable. So just to recap a little bit, prior knowledge of the topic, the scope, the breadth, the complexity of the topic, the amount of relevant literature that you're able to find, 10 sources versus 1,000 sources, your general experience writing literature reviews. Because as with any type of writing, if you already have some genre knowledge and you have a good mental model for approaching different writing tasks, things will be a little bit more straightforward. If this is your first time writing a literature review, it might be a little bit complicated because you're still building that understanding of what constitutes an effective literature review. And then something else to consider is the context of publication, simply because that is going to determine how much information, how much detail you're going to include in that literature review in the first place. If you're working on a thesis or a dissertation, for instance, you might have an entire chapter. So you could have, 20 pages, 30 pages that constitutes your literature review. In contrast, if you are pursuing publication, and you're writing a journal article, the entire journal article might be anywhere from like 3 to 5,000 words, and your literature review might be at most 1,000 words. So the brevity or the length of the literature review is going to be very heavily informed by that context of publication. So lots of different factors that we have to account for when we're taking on a task like this. So one of the things we want to be mindful of is given that this is a pretty complex task that we're being asked to do, we want to figure out, well, where can we find some efficiencies? And you might be familiar with the saying around like basically the main when we're talking about inefficiency, it's about it involves spending more time on tasks than we need to. And so we want to reduce some of those inefficiencies where possible. So when we think about what we have to do, we have to locate that literature, we have to build the knowledge, we have to write the text. It's really about trying to figure out where we can avoid repeating the same actions. All of this is going to take time. It's very difficult to speed run a literature review. And so having some plans in place and being consistent with following those plans will help to ensure that we're being a little bit more efficient. That being said, again, if this is one of the first times you've written a literature review, you want to account for the fact that there's going to be just general learning that's happening in parallel to putting this document together in the first place. So make sure that you are giving yourself enough time to work through this type of process. So we want to be flexible as much as we want to have a plan, right? We have a plan, but we account for the fact that we might have to modify that plan as we go through this process. So in that locating literature phase, we might have to adjust the scope, right? If we're finding that we just can't find much relevant information, we're going to have to start conceptualizing our literature review a little bit differently so that we can start accessing more information. Or it might be an opportunity to work closely with a librarian to ensure that we're actually using the right type of databases. Or it might be that we haven't given enough consideration to gray literature. So literature that is published outside of the academy, for instance. So looking at everything from, literature that is published by nonprofits and government to information that is shared by elders and indigenous communities. So we really want to make sure that we are aware of the range of knowledge and information that is available to us and how to access that. And as we're encountering information, as we're reading, as we're reflecting, a lot of the time we're going to realize, oh, I didn't anticipate this question that I now have, or I didn't anticipate that there would be this interpretation out there that I'm now learning about as it relates to a given topic. And so, as we encounter unexpected information, it might be that we have to go back and make some adjustments to our literature searching to find more literature in a slightly in a related but slightly different area of investigation than we were originally anticipating. And then, as we're writing, um, sometimes we'll be writing and writing and writing, making great progress. And then maybe someone in a lab group or one of our peers or a supervisor will say, like, oh, hey, did you read this paper that was published last week? And we encounter that paper, and it's a great paper, but oh my goodness, it is so similar to what we've been writing on. We now have to ensure that we're incorporating reference to that paper and figuring out how to sort of fit it in to everything else that we've been working on. So it's not a straightforward process necessarily. It is an iterative process that requires some flexibility, but knowing that There are some ways to streamline certain aspects, while maintaining a bit of flexibility is often really key to working through this type of writing task. All right. So my next question is, because I made reference a moment ago to the importance of building knowledge as we are reading all the information that we're gathering. What kind of reading or note-taking strategies are you currently using? Because this is where we can learn from each other and sort of reflect on whether or not our own strategies are serving us in the way that we need them to. So again, take a minute or two, contribute in the chat. What kind of reading or note-taking strategies do you currently use? So we're seeing a range of approaches, everything from color coding, multipass reading, spreadsheet, taking notes while reading, logbooks, using Zotero, initial quick read. So all of these approaches are great. What we want to be mindful of is if you are hesitating and you're like, well, I'm not sure that I have like a specific strategy that I'm following, that's usually an indication that it's time to intentionally have a strategy. Because with a literature review, you're managing so much information from so many sources. You don't want to be in a situation where you're like, oh, I've read something that I know I want to make reference to, but I can't quite remember what source it's from. I've been there. I've been there. When I was learning how to write literature reviews for the first time, I didn't really have a systematic approach for keeping track of information. And so I'd be in that situation of going through files upon files upon files because I knew there was a really relevant source that I had read, but I just hadn't captured that information in a way that was easy for me to recall. So that is something that I'm urging you to consider if you don't already have a system in place. So when we're thinking about reading and note-taking, we want to be intentional about it. So when we are reading, when we're taking notes, it helps to support our memory. It helps us to actually retain information in the first place and start making those connections for ourselves. It can help us to generate ideas. So as we're taking notes while we're reading, we want to keep track of the questions that we have, of the connections that we're noticing, because that will give us material for our literature review, because that is reflecting our critical engagement with the literature. And as we're taking notes, we're also, again, helping to support that overall writing process and the overall writing of the literature review, because we're starting to think about the sources that might be more heavily featured compared to others because of the potential relevance to the topic at hand. So you want to be really mindful of how you're approaching your reading and your note taking. And there's reference to a synthesis matrix, and that's something that we're actually going to be talking about in a little bit of detail momentarily. But I want to talk a bit about synthesis. So, synthesis is just another way of making reference to how we start to see patterns across different forms of information. And this seems like potentially a little bit of a silly exercise, but it is one that I use for talking about synthesis because it helps us to tap into our ability to organize information in a logical way. So, your task now is to sort these images. And we'll take about a minute or two. You can comment in the chat how you're approaching the organization of this information, and then we'll continue. So, looking at all of this information on the slide, how might you sort or organize these images? So we have some suggestions popping up in the chat, and we see that there's not necessarily a consensus emerging. And that's the point of an exercise like this, because ultimately you're going to be responsible for seeing patterns and organizing those patterns, and conveying those patterns in what's hopefully a logical way to your readers. Um, and this is something that we're very primed to do as humans. We start to see where things might fit together, even if our interpretations might be slightly different. So we have some suggestions around like sleeping versus non-sleeping animal versus non-animal, the treasure chest being like an outlier or the ice cream being an outlier, animals, foods, and other. We have reference to subcategories. We have, oh, the style of the pictures. So, like illustrative versus cartoony, for instance. So, lots of different ways in which we could organize this information. Um, so I love a Venn diagram. So I'm just going to show some examples based on a Venn diagram. So here we might have large categories of animals versus food with a little bit of an overlap between with that image of the cat with the plate of food and then that outlier of the treasure chest. Alternately, you might be a little bit more narrow. So you might have black and white animals versus cats versus food. Again, a little bit of overlap and also an outlier. Or you might have sleep, food, and then two outliers. Lots of different ways for thinking about how this information might relate. And you might be asking yourself, well, what does this have to do with a literature review? Well, when we're reading through the literature, we're trying to find those patterns. We're trying to find those clusters. We're trying to figure out where there's overlap. So we're really focused on pattern recognition. And this is something that many of us are exposed to from the time we are very small children. So often there's a game, like one of these things is not like the other. That's teaching us to recognize pattern. And we've been looking at it from the perspective of images for this exercise. But this is essentially what we're doing in a literature review on a more conceptual level. So when we're talking about synthesis, it really emerges initially from our source selection because we're making decisions all the time about information to include or exclude. Because, sometimes we'll encounter a source and from the title, it seems like it's going to be so relevant to what we're working on. And then we read the abstract and we realize, oh, this is not at all what I thought it was going to. And I make a decision that I'm not going to include it in my literature review. But eventually, we collect a lot of sources that are going to form the basis of this writing. And once we have those sources pulled together, we start to try and figure out how they might connect. And there was reference a few minutes ago to the value of a matrix, for instance, a synthesis matrix template. And the premise of this kind of organizational approach is just to keep things organized. So keeping track of our source, the details from the source, the key themes that emerge, because this is going to help us start to see and understand the relationships that exist across multiple forms of information. And using an Excel template can be very useful for doing this. As you fill out these matrices, you basically create for yourself a personalized searchable catalog that reflects the research literature that you have been um, encountering and collecting for your literature review. And so as you start to fill it up, you might have some cells that remain blank because not every source is going to have all of the themes that you've been identifying. That's expected. But as you progress, as you fill out a matrix like this, you'll start to notice, oh, okay, here I have these 5 sources, for instance, that all relate to this specific theme. So when I'm writing a paragraph about this specific theme or sub-theme in my literature review, I now have an easy way to ensure that I'm able to go back to those sources and pull from them in order to flesh out the interpretation or the writing around a given theme or sub-theme, for instance. So if this is something that is appealing to you, a resource that I'd encourage you to check out that's freely available online is a template called the Conceptual Synthesis Excel Dump Template. This is made available by Dr. Raul Pacheco Vega. And his website just generally is a very useful resource for students because he provides just lots of insight into lots of different research and academic writing topics. So if you're thinking, yes, I think I need to keep track of information in this very systematic way, then you can just download this template for free from his website. Okay, so now we're going to shift focus a little bit. We're still thinking about synthesis, but we're now thinking about synthesis from the perspective of writing. And I'm going to launch a poll for you to indicate your preference. And I'm going to read through both of these examples, and then you just choose which one you prefer. And if you want to explain why you prefer one of the options over the other, you can articulate that in the chat if you'd like. So example 1 reads as follows. Baptiste reviewed 85 instances of older women who experienced hip fractures following falls. He determined that in most cases, these falls were preventable. Beyond the physiological impact of these falls, the costs associated with such injuries were significant. Adams also studied instances of older women experiencing hip fractures in her study. According to her research, most of these falls were preventable. In 2018, Statistics Canada released a report on the costs associated with bone fractures in older adult populations, which often result in expensive hospitalizations. These injuries are often caused by falls and are largely preventable. Example 2. Bone fractures experienced by older adults often result in expensive hospitalizations. However, some of these injuries and associated costs may be avoidable. For instance, two studies on hip fractures experienced by older women who had fallen found that most falls were preventable. So take a couple of moments to, oh, where's the poll gone? Is it? Okay, it should be open. Yes, okay, it is open. It just disappeared from my screen for a moment. So we'll take like 30 more seconds. It's not something that you necessarily have to overthink. It really is about your reader preference. And I'll share the results once folks have had a chance to respond. So it looks like we're just waiting for one or two more responses, and some folks are commenting in the chat. Okay, so just to keep an eye on the time, I'm going to end the poll and share. So we have, in case it's not on your screen, we have a slight preference, or not a slight preference, but a general preference for that second example, choice two, with just over 60% of respondents indicating that as their preference. And often that's what I see when I go through this activity. There tends to be a general trend where we see preference for that second example. But we see value in both, right? In the first example, there might be some preference because there's a little bit more detail. But if you don't need that level of detail from the individual sources, then example two can be preferred because it's a little bit more concise and it is focusing more strongly on some of those connections across the studies. So we're looking at, again, choices that we always have to grapple with as writers. How much information does my reader require in order to understand? And so this is something we have to make judgments about all the time. So when we're thinking about synthesis, both examples are forms of synthesis, but we're seeing much denser synthesis in that second example. And when we have denser synthesis, it can help reduce some of the repetition that might otherwise appear. It might help make patterns in literature more obvious to our readers. And so sometimes it's going to be necessary to provide more detail from certain sources for various reasons. But depending on how closely sources overlap in terms of the information that they share, sometimes we can be far more concise, far more dense with our synthesis. So one thing we do want to avoid is sometimes there can be a tendency in literature reviews to have like one paragraph being a summary, the next paragraph being a summary, the next paragraph being a summary. That kind of approach sometimes defeats the purpose of a literature review because a reader might start to wonder, well, why don't I just go to those sources and read those myself? Because I'm actually having to do a lot of work in terms of understanding how those sources relate to each other. So we want to be mindful that we have a responsibility as writers to make the relationship across different sources clear for our readers, recognizing that, yes, sometimes we're going to require more detail from certain sources, but not every single source requires the same amount of detail. So we want to manage detail, relationships, and readability. And that's where really foregrounding synthesis can help us to manage those expectations. So when we're working with literature, we're going to start to recognize that there are different patterns emerging because there are lots of different studies that focus on very similar questions. Um, and so when we have that degree of commonality, we have the flexibility to group that information in a more concise way. So for instance, if we have these three studies that are all coming to this same conclusion that sleep is essential to brain health and development, we can cluster that information through these group citations just to make it clear that this information is shared across multiple studies. But if we have studies that are a little bit different, they don't relate as closely, then we don't force them into that same cluster. We have them as their own piece of information. So, for instance, we might write, however, what constitutes quality sleep remains disputed, and maybe that is just being pulled from one source in particular. So when we do this, when we start to recognize that some information is going to closely relate to multiple studies, whereas other information is going to be specific to individual studies or literature, this just reflects the fact that we have a really good understanding of the complexity of the academic conversation that we're trying to capture and share out with our readers. So let's take a look at some synthesis in action. Here we have a paragraph from an article entitled The Effect of Mode of Delivery on Postpartum Comfort Level and Breastfeeding Self-Efficacy, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. So my question to you is, how many studies are being cited in total when you look at this paragraph? And how dense would you say this synthesis is? So take a look. How many studies are being cited? And how dense would you describe this synthesis? So just take a minute or so, um, and then we'll continue. Yes, we have four citations, or yeah, we have four studies cited in total, I should say. We have one study that's cited twice. So the two is cited twice, but we have four studies being cited in total. And how dense would you say this synthesis is? Is it very dense? Is it sort of medium density? Is it low density? Yeah, I would agree. This is sort of a middle of the road level of density. This is what you're often going to gravitate toward, right? Where most sentences have a citation, but we don't have a lot of group citations. So it's, yeah, overall sort of medium density. Let's take a look at another example. So just to highlight again, we have these four unique studies being cited. We have one study cited twice, and we have a mixture of individual and grouped citations. So really just sort of middle of the road approach to citation and density here. So when we look at our next sample, question is, okay, how many studies are being cited in total and how dense is the synthesis? Of course, we're seeing a different citation style here compared to our previous example. So we have five studies being cited in total. And is this high, medium, or lower density? Yeah, I would say it's like a medium high in terms of overall density. First, it's a shorter paragraph compared to the previous example, but we actually have one more study being cited here. And we also have some group citations or some or multiple citations in the same sentence. So we're moving into that higher density. Um, there are examples out there with extremely dense synthesis, where you might have group citations of like 20 sources. I didn't go that extreme with this example. So let's take a closer look. So we have those five studies being cited, and we have a mixture of individual and grouped, and also just different styles of citation. So we actually have a narrative style where you're integrating the source into the grammatical structure of the sentence. And then in that last sentence, we see how you can have multiple studies being referenced, but not necessarily as a grouped citation. So this can be a really good option for when you want to have a sentence that has, multiple ideas in it from different sources, but there's not a lot of overlap in terms of the details between those studies. So when we're thinking about synthesis, we're always thinking about citation as well to make it clear to our readers where information came from. Okay, so let's talk about organizing literature reviews. We've sort of started from, in some ways, the ground up, really focusing on synthesis, but now we're going to think about that overall approach for organizing a literature review. So there are different ways in which you can think about how you might structure a literature review, and there's overlap across these different approaches. My advice to you is we're going to be looking at one approach, but you might encounter advice or resources that have different approaches that they recommend. And I say, if it makes sense to you, then use that as your entry point. So you don't have to do exactly what I'm making reference to today. You want to find structures that you know that you'll be able to use effectively, and that will work for your reader. Because ultimately, it is ensuring that your reader is understanding what you're trying to communicate to them. So our approach is based on this model that's known as create a research space or CARS. And the premise of this model is that it has three rhetorical moves: establish research territory, identify a gap, occupy the gap. It is a very basic structure that works across all disciplines. It works very well for literature reviews. It can also work well for research proposals, other types of academic writing. And because it is quite simple in a conceptual way, it can be very appealing for people because they can see how they can apply it to lots of different topics. So another way to think about cars is what's already been done. What have other people already discovered? What have they shared? What have they written? What hasn't been done? And what am I doing in response to some of that, some of those unknowns? So we're going to look at cars in practice. We're going to interrogate how a sort of modest literature review makes use of these moves. So it's a 5 paragraph long literature review from an article entitled Mental Health Symptoms Unexpectedly Increased in Students Aged 11 to 19 Years during the 3.5 years after the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, findings from 9,376 survey responses. So I'm going to open up the poll so that we can really figure out where we see these moves. To begin, we'll look at the introductory paragraph. And as I read through this introductory paragraph, I would encourage you to contribute in the chat. What kind of information is being shared with our readers? How is the shared knowledge being established? What do we notice about what an introductory paragraph has to achieve? So let's take a look and feel free to contribute in the chat. In May 2016, a large wildfire affected Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada, and the surrounding area. Called the Beast in the popular media, the wildfire necessitated the evacuation of the entire city on May 3rd, 2016, and over 88,000 residents were displaced for several weeks. In addition to damaging community structures and infrastructure, the fire destroyed 10% of the homes in Fort McMurray, leaving many individuals homeless. The fire burned 590,000 hectares of land before it was brought under control on July 4th, 2016. Insurance costs for the damages were estimated at 3.6 billion by the Insurance Bureau of Canada, which made the Fort McMurray wildfire the most expensive insured catastrophe in Canadian history. Many individuals were left jobless due to damage and closure of local businesses. Social, emotional, and psychological difficulties also affected the community, as is typical after severe disasters. So, what kind of information do the authors share with their readers? How are they establishing shared knowledge? Why is it important to establish shared knowledge? So we already have a summary in the chat. So we have this large wildfire, the location, and the damage it created. So we have sort of the incident, location, and the implications of that. Anything else? Anything else that is shared in that introductory paragraph that is essential for readers? Yep. So we have the date, a temporal context, and those impacts. So introductory paragraphs are very important because you never know who is going to be engaging with the work. So providing contextual information is going to be essential. We have a geographic context. We have a historical or temporal context. We have a financial context. We have a human context, right? Yes, the ideas start out big and get smaller. So we have this kind of narrowing funneling effect, right? We begin with the larger piece of information before starting to narrow and get closer to what the focus of the actual article is. Because theoretically, someone 10 years from now could be reading this article. Someone in a completely different part of the world could be reading this article, right? The analogy I often use is when we think about countries that have to deal with the implications of forest fires, think of a place like Australia, right? Australians Australian researchers, Australian policymakers, they might have a vague recognition about what happened or happens in Canada. But this kind of contextual information is going to give them enough to latch on to in order to then understand the research context in a much more accessible way. So we always want to think about the role of our introductory paragraph in terms of welcoming our readers into our topic. So now we're going to start reading through the body paragraphs, and this is where we can expect to see potentially those car moves. So I'm going to open up the poll, and as we read through, you're just going to identify which moves you think are present if you notice any moves in this paragraph. So let's take a closer look. Disasters tend to impact children and youth in particular, given developmental vulnerabilities, cognitive, emotional, social, and physiological, associated with childhood and adolescence, including the need to rely on others for support. Our group has previously examined Fort McMurray School mental health surveys completed by grades 7 through 12 students in November 2017. In November 2017. Brown et al. Reported elevated mental health symptoms for PTSD and depression compared to a control population from the same province which had not experienced a natural disaster. As reported in Study 13, individuals who were more personally impacted by the 2016 wildfire, such as having their home destroyed, exhibited greater symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and alcohol and/or substance misuse. These findings were consistent with previous findings of altered mental health in youth following natural disasters. So let's take a minute or so and contribute in the poll. Which move or moves do you see as being present in this first body paragraph? And if you're not sure, you can always click on none, or you can make your best educated guess. So just take about 30 more seconds just so that we stay on time, and then we'll continue and look at the next paragraph. All right, so I'm going to end the poll. And I'll share the results. And what we see is most folks who responded really identified that first move, the establishing of research territory. And then we had a sprinkling of reference to those other moves or to none. So let's take a closer look. So, which move or moves is present? What we see is that the establishment of the research territory. We have 9 studies being referenced here. We have a narrowing of focus, so that initially we had reference broadly to the human impact. In our first body paragraph, we're really now starting to focus in on children and youth, which is not unsurprising given the actual title of this research study. Um, and we have some contextual information because we know that these authors have done some similar research in the past. So they're not making reference to the current study, but they are making note of the fact that they have done comparable work previously. But we have just a lot of findings, a lot of information that have stemmed from either the work of the authors previously or the work of other researchers. And we have some phrasing that helps to reinforce that. Previously examined, as reported, these findings were consistent with previous findings. So this is all alluding to the work that other people have been doing. So let's take a look at our next paragraph. I apologize for the smallness of the font, but it is just a larger paragraph. So I will relaunch the poll and we'll read through it and we'll respond. What move or moves are present in our next paragraph? Previous studies have also reported links between wildfires and adverse mental health effects in adults and children, including increased symptoms of PTSD, increased symptoms of depression and anxiety, mental health difficulties, reduction in health and well-being, increased consumption of anxiolytics, hypnotics, and decreased capacity to cope with adversity. The combined adverse impacts of wildfire disasters on individuals' mental health and coping abilities, particularly in youth, are important because coping plays a major role in post-disaster recovery, and lack thereof can be detrimental to long-term mental health outcomes. Also see Study 34. More generally, non-wildfire disasters, including floods, earthquakes, and tsunamis, have also been linked to adverse effects on mental health in adults and children in the form of increased symptoms or incidences of PTSD, major depressive disorder, suicidality, generalized anxiety disorder, and substance use disorder. Displacement caused by natural disasters, example, short and long-term evacuation, homelessness, imposes additional physical, emotional, and psychosocial stress on families, which may then adversely affect longer-term development of children and youth. So, reading through this paragraph, what move or moves do you see in this writing? So we'll just take another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll end the poll, look at the responses, take a look at the paragraph, and move on to the next paragraph. All right, so most people have had a chance to respond. I just want to keep an eye on the time. So everyone who did respond identified that first move, and then we had a handful of people who made reference to the gap. So let's take a look and see what move or moves are present in this paragraph. Okay. So our first indication that this paragraph is really going to be focused on that research territory is this kind of phrasing. Previous studies have also reported. So there is an initial framing that we're probably going to be very much immersed in the work that other people have done, the research findings that they have found based on that research. The paragraph is more even more densely synthesized than our previous paragraph. We have 22 studies or forms of information being cited here. And we're really trying to sustain that argument of why this is something that we should be paying attention to, because we're seeing the harms associated with surviving these kinds of natural disasters. And we also have a little bit of broadening out in terms of thinking about disasters more holistically. We have references beyond wildfires, even though that is the main entry point. And so that's an example of, slightly divergent thinking in terms of recognizing that the scope of the what we might be referencing might be a little bit larger than our particular topic, because even though those are obviously different types of natural disasters, the impacts on the people who survive them are comparable. So let's take a look at our next paragraph. And once again, I will open up the poll and let's read through it and see what moves are in place here. Longitudinal studies, most of which have focused on adults, have reported long-term negative impacts on mental health from natural disasters. The pattern of long-term effects can be complex, with individuals exhibiting better recovery from some symptoms, such as depression or anxiety, but lesser recovery for others, such as PTSD symptoms. Relatively few longitudinal studies have focused on mental health outcomes among youth following natural disaster, although studies of children and youth following Hurricane Katrina have shown long-term impacts on mental health, with varying recovery trajectories for different groups. We are aware of only 3 population studies that examined wildfire impacts on youth mental health, including one study focusing on PTSD and depression, and our previous Fort McMurray studies. So, what move or moves are present in this paragraph? Okay, so most people have had a chance to respond. Let's take a look. Okay, so we have some reference to established research territory, and then the reference to the gap is becoming very, very dominant, and then there's reference to occupy the gap. So let's take a look at our paragraph. And we have 2 moves for the first time. We still have a little bit of that research territory, right? We have those 8 studies being referenced early on, those longitudinal studies, because that's a point of interest here. The study that these authors are carrying out has a longitudinal design, so it makes sense that we're now focusing on that research approach. But what becomes very interesting is that the design topic itself becomes the pivot for recognizing that we have some gaps of knowledge here. Relatively few longitudinal studies have focused on mental health outcomes among youth following natural disaster. So we don't have that much information out there. And so this is alluding to a gap of knowledge. So there being very few studies taking that have this design looking at this particular topic and this particular type of population. So this is where we're starting to see some justification for why these authors might have taken a longitudinal lens to this population and to this topic. So let's take a look at our final paragraph, and I will relaunch the poll. So let's take a look. In the present study, our hypothesis was that mental health symptoms among Fort McMurray youth would improve with time following the November 2017 survey. This hypothesis was based on theoretical work on trauma recovery, which consistently emphasizes the role of time in the recovery process. To test this hypothesis, we examined mental health survey data collected by Fort McMurray school boards in grades 7 through 12 in November across 3 consecutive years, including 2017, 2018, and 2019. This repeated testing was conducted 1.5, 2.5, and 3.5 years after the 2016 wildfire. All data were collected prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. We hypothesized specifically that symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and alcohol/substance use would steadily improve from 2017 to 2018 to 2019. So just take a few more seconds and then we'll continue just to make sure we finish on time. Okay, so most folks have had a chance to respond, and perhaps unsurprisingly, given that we're at the last paragraph, we have that occupy the gap move. Some folks have made reference to established research territory, and I can appreciate that because we do have some studies being referenced here in relation to trauma recovery. But the main focus of the paragraph ultimately is related to occupy the gap. But we do see how these moves aren't necessarily discrete. There can be a little bit of overlap among them. So, but the core takeaway from this paragraph is really related to the present study, how it is basically responding to that gap that was identified in the previous paragraph. So this is just one example of cars in practice. And what I want to encourage you to do is if you know that you're going to be working on a literature review, spend some time interrogating the structures of literature reviews that are being published in your field. Because that's going to give you a lot of insight into thinking about how you might pull information together, how you might organize and structure that information for your readers. This can seem maybe a little bit tedious to go through, but that reverse engineering is actually very, very useful for helping us to build our mental models for understanding genre conventions. And the more we are able to sort of get a sense of what the final product should look like, it can be easier for us to approach the writing of it. That's not to say that the writing is necessarily going to be straightforward all the time. Writing seldom is, but knowing what we're working toward can be very clarifying. So, of course, one of the challenges with the CARS model is that within those sections, you still have to do some organization, right? The what is known piece can be especially complex because you have to still figure out how all of these different sources relate to each other that you're pulling from. And so you might think of it in terms of, well, maybe I'll use like a chronological approach, but generally speaking, a thematic approach is the most common. So really thinking about, how different theories cluster together or how we see agreement or disagreement. Maybe there's like some causal or correlated relationships. We're looking at different findings. Or it might be that we focus on research design and that's how we're starting to cluster information. So it is, um, we do have to sort of still figure out how all those pieces relate. Now, when it comes to the what is not known piece, this is where language can be used very effectively so that we can very overtly communicate to our readers the fact that there is a gap of knowledge here. So in the example that we saw a moment ago, it was a little bit subtle, right? We had reference to relatively few studies, and only three studies. So as readers, we sort of had to make a little bit of an inference that that language was helping to communicate some sort of a gap. But we can be more explicit with that. So we can think about the nature of the gaps that we want to communicate, whether this is a lack of related research, a lack of clarity among existing studies, the limitations of existing studies, and then use the knowledge of those gaps to communicate them out. So we can be very explicit if we want. A gap, we can use that phrasing, a gap. We can use words like unknown or unclear or something being poorly understood. Questions remain. Little research has been done. Few studies have. Lack of studies. Something not being sufficiently studied. This all helps to signal that, hey, there's a lack of clarity here. There's still something that we need to investigate. And guess what? I might be doing some work that might help to shed some light on this. Now, a point of caution. Depending where you are in your research career, you might start identifying gaps that might not actually be gaps. So you want to be sure that you've done enough reading that your claims of a gap are justified. So you want to make sure that you have collected and read enough literature. You might want to double check with a librarian, discuss with your supervisor, if that's the context in which you're working, just to ensure that any claims of gaps are justified. Because you don't want to be in a situation where someone says, you're saying that there's a gap of knowledge here, but I can list off five studies that have all found this information. You don't want to be in that situation. And then what is the will be or what is now known? This is when you're making a reference to your own research study, if the literature review is helping to create the context for a unique study. So when you're making reference to your work, you want to indicate what it has achieved, what problems that it solved, and you can make use of language that very overtly refers to the research that you have done. So, the present study, my research, the contribution of this work, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so organizing information. We have about 9 minutes left. We have about 10 slides. We'll go through quickly. So when we're thinking about our literature review, we recognize that we're likely going to approach it from this thematic perspective. But how do all of those themes, sub-themes, and sub-sub-themes actually relate? Well, it kind of depends, right? This sort of links back to that earlier synthesis exercise where we saw that we had different approaches for organizing that information. And that's okay, right? This is reflecting how you as a researcher think about information. And so you want to think about how your interpretation will be communicated out to your reader. And so really thinking about what information someone needs at certain points of the reading process is a skill, an insight that we want to develop as writers, as thinkers. So you're probably already familiar with the concept of mind mapping, and using mind maps early on in the writing process can be a very useful way for seeing the conceptual links across different themes and sub-themes and sub-sub-themes and figuring out how those might align. Because at this point in the writing process, things are still pretty flexible, which is quite nice. So, for instance, maybe you're writing a literature review about bone fractures in older adult populations, and you've identified a couple of core themes. So, you're looking at bone density, interventions, cost, demographic shifts. And some of these larger themes have smaller themes or sub-themes within them. And you could use the structure and just start writing from the left-hand side to the right, and you would have something that might be understandable. But at this stage, take some time and sort of play around with structure to think about if information could be moved around to better serve your readers' needs. So you could go from this kind of structure to a slightly different structure where you might actually move some of those themes and actually put them in like your introduction, for instance, in order to contextualize the topic for your readers. Maybe you're going to reduce the number of key themes that you're going to focus on using this approach. But ultimately, in doing so, create a clear narrative for your readers. So now you would go from an introduction that makes reference to demographic shifts and costs related to bone fractures in older adult populations, which provides a really useful framing for then learning about, well, why bone fractures occur in the first place, well, it relates to bone density and the aging process and then possible interventions for reducing bone fractures within that demographic group, and the potential benefits and merits to, or those merits and costs associated with those interventions. Because once you have a sort of practical mind map, this can help you shift to outlining. And if you've been keeping track of your notes in a synthesis matrix, you can take all of that information and start populating your outline so that you know, okay, I'm writing a paragraph about bone formation. I have these 3 or 4 sources that I know specifically relate to bone formation, and that's what I'm going to base my paragraph on. And so this can seem, in some ways, a little bit mechanical or prescriptive, but in terms of being able to write a first draft of a literature review, this can make things a little bit more manageable, which can be quite useful when taking on a complex writing task like this. So once you're working with a mind map, once you're working with an outline, you can move things around. Even as you're writing your first and second, third drafts, you can reorganize information. Very useful to get feedback in the early stages of writing once you've had worked on a first draft. Getting someone else's perspective can be so valuable for understanding what a reader actually needs from you. Now, how much detail do I need? This is something we touched on in relation to the written synthesis examples early on. So again, everything's going to be context specific. So some of the questions you can ask yourself, well, if I want more information, if I want to include more detail from a particular source, why? Why am I highlighting it? Is the source so conventional that it acts as a very useful example for understanding other sources? Alternately, is it an outlier that I want to pull attention to because it does distort the narrative in some way that is potentially relevant? Or is the source very closely aligned to the current study? So maybe it's looking at a very comparable demographic, and so it might be worth highlighting that source as a result. And are you critiquing the source? Are you highlighting it in order to critique? So these are kind of the questions you want to ask yourself. If we look at this example, for instance, this is from an article titled Prevalence of Acute Neck Pain Following Sports-Related Concussion in High School Athletes. And here they're really focusing on a particular study. Although one study explored the prevalence of neck pain in an adolescent athletic population and revealed that adolescents may be more susceptible to neck pain following a concussion, this study was restricted to athletes who were seen in an emergency room, representing only a small percentage of sports-related concussion. So it's being highlighted in order to identify its limitations, because this is a very closely related study. And if studies are very closely related, we might have to justify why we're doing our work. Well, our work is a little bit different. Our work is arguably an improvement on someone else's work. And so that helps to justify why we're doing the work that we're doing, even though on a superficial level, it might seem as if other people have already done similar research. All right, next steps, 2 minutes left. I've already stated this, but I will reiterate it. Review literature reviews in your field. This is going to help you to, again, to recognize the structures, the approaches, the language, the expectations around density of synthesis, the number of citations. This is such a valuable process for you to build that mental model. Look at how reviews are being organized. Are they using CARS moves? Are they using a different approach? How are they synthesizing that information? What kind of language are they using to, uh, make reference to other people's work, to make reference to gaps, to critique other people's work? All right. So as we wrap up, but don't forget, Cecilia, credibility in academia absolutely depends on a thorough literature search. If it's relevant, you have to cite it, even if you don't agree with the same methodology. I have to reference without deference. That's the preference. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today, for all of your contributions. I am happy to stick around if there are questions, but otherwise you can also reach out to me directly. I'll just pop my email in there again. And of course, I wish you all the best as you work on literature reviews or other writing tasks.
Thanks, Jill. Much appreciated. Jill has two more workshops next week for us, so make sure you come back for those. What have we got, Jill? Those are. Oh, I had them right here. Integrating evidence and scientific writing. So, two more great workshops next week from Jill. I did want to mention quickly, we've got the more information up on the website now around the storytelling competition, where there will be some workshops around that. So, I'm just going to post a link to the teaser video for the storytelling competition is now, information is up for that. There'll be workshops this summer. And the other piece I wanted to mention to everybody is there's been some questions around the Sure Symposium date. We do have a save the date for the Sure Symposium, which is August 26th. So application submission will be open for that later this summer. But if you're thinking about getting your research into the poster symposium at the end of summer, we highly recommend you do that. Hoping you will do that. And yeah, August 26th. So put that on your calendar as a save date. Okay, folks, thanks very much. Thanks, Jill. And hopefully we'll see you all next week at some more of these workshops.
And if you come to because they're both going to be hybrid next week.